Welcome to the Fighting on Film podcast, the podcast all about classic and obscure war movies, from the Normandy landings to the days of chivalry and swords. If it's been captured on film, we're going to try and cover it. I'm Robbie of RM Military History.
I'm Matthew Moss of Historical Firearms and the Armourer's Bench. Hello there, sorry to interrupt. I wanted to let you know that you can now join our supporting cast over on Patreon. As thanks for your support, you'll be able to help us pick films, submit questions for guests, have first pick on brand new and exclusive merch, and much more. Thank you for your support. Now back to the show.
Hello, welcome back to the show. Now this week we tackle one of the big ones with 1969's The Battle of Britain. Now, to help us with this one, we're joined by military and aviation historian James Jeffries, who specialises in the war in the air and British cultural memory of it. James, welcome to the show. It's been a long time in the making, this one. It's great to have you with us.
I'm so excited about this. This is the film that got me into history, watching it as, I don't know, since I could remember, just seeing all the Spitfires and Hurricanes and everything. And I was just filled with questions. I want to know what happened before. I want to know what happened afterwards. And here I am. Yeah, doing a PhD on it. I get to write about it. So yeah,
I love that because that's what we talk about quite often, isn't it, on the pod, where we talk about how films have that power to make you want to go and find out more about a subject. And yeah, I think this is definitely one of those films that does that. It makes you want to go and find out even more of the context. Although the film does a pretty thorough job of laying out a lot of the story and a lot of the background to the battle, but that's something I'm sure we'll talk about in a moment.
Definitely. Should we do the production first this week, Matt, and then go to cast?
Absolutely, if you want to, yeah.
Great. So the film was directed by French-born British director Guy Hamilton. He served in the Royal Navy during the Second World War. He actually won a Distinguished Service Cross. So I think he might be one of the few directors we've done, Matt, that actually has a medal-winning director.
A DSC is quite nothing to scoff at, is it? Wow.
Well, apparently he was left behind during the operation. He spent a month behind enemy lines before he was picked up again.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
Should have made a movie about it.
Right, yeah.
So he directed his first war film in 1955 with the Colditz Story. He also co-wrote that one. Then in 1961, he directed the David Niven film The Best of Enemies. He also directed the 1966 sequel to The Pressfile Funeral in Berlin.
Nice.
And he also directed 4 Bond films, starting with Goldfinger in 1967. And then later on in his career, he directed Force 10 from Navarone in 1978. I love that film. It's good. I won't hear anything wrong about it.
Don't shut me up.
Getting in there quick. It's got Apollo Creed in a Denison smock, Matt. What more do you want?
I know. That's one of its few redeeming
exactly.
features.
And it was written by a duo of Scottish writer James Kennaway. He also wrote Tunes of Glory, and Wilfrid Greatorex, who was one of the creators behind The Secret Army and the Edward Woodward dystopian drama 1990. And he also served as Roy Urquhart's ghostwriter on his 1958 Arnhem book, which is interesting.
No way.
Oh, wow. That's incredible.
Yeah. He also did The Planemakers. And its sequel, he did an ITV drama called Hine, which is all about a weapons contractor in the 70s. He did a lot of stuff. Like, he was known as probably one of the most consummate screenwriters of his generation. He was really famous chap.
The 70s was such a good time for TV. You had the Sweeney, The Professionals. You got programs about what happens if communism gets the grip with 1990. Yeah. You got a program about a weapons manufacturer. You don't get any of that now. We just get Midsummer's Murders and God knows what else.
Yeah, like 20 police procedurals a year.
Yeah.
The legendary Harry Saltzman served as one of the film's producers, and it was distributed by United Artists. Cinematography, I think we've covered him before on the show, Matt, but it was by 3-time Oscar winner Freddie Young, who worked on Lawrence of Arabia, Lord Jim, Dr. Zhivago, Ryan's Daughter, among others. Soundtracks by Ron Goodwin, and I think it's composed by William Walton. Goodwin is no stranger to war films. You know, if you're a fan of the pod, you've been listening for a while, you'll know his name. His credits include 633 Squadron, Where Eagles Dare, Submarine X1, The Magnificent Men in Their Flying Machines, to name but a few. You know, if you're a war film fan, you'll have heard his work.
That's a CV, isn't it?
I know, right?
Yeah, brilliant. Absolutely iconic tunes.
not to mention like the sea of other works he's done. It's quite a CV. So filming for this one took place at Duxford, Debden, North Weald, and Hawkinge. They're all RAF, famous places. All operational stations in 1940. One surviving First World War Belfast hangar at Duxford was blown up and demolished for the Eagle Day sequence. It's also some of it was filmed in Bovingdon. The Dunkirk beach scene was shot in Spain in Huelva. Is it Huelva? I'm probably going to butcher that.
I wouldn't. No, I don't know.
No, I know. They're not a Spanish football team, I don't think. Well, they're not in the division that I know of, so I'm not going to attempt it. Some aerial shots were also undertaken in Malta, and apparently shots taken upwards were filmed in Spain, and shots where you can see the ground were shot in the UK. Nice way to know
sensible.
What part of the movie you're looking at. Yeah, exactly. And 11 Group's operations room was used, and that survives as part of the Battle of Britain bunker. St Catherine's Dock in London served as location for the Blitz scenes. And we were kindly sent an extraction from Britain at War magazine from its editor, Simon Stabler. And I'll read you a piece written by Christina Hawley, remembering her youth growing up in East London. So she says, in 1968, a film crew arrived near Dragon Row to shoot blitz scenes for the Battle of Britain, the iconic movie starring Michael Caine. The houses were due for demolition, so the crew let rip with special effects, which was terribly exciting. We were drawn to the site by searchlights, which lit up the night sky, and a huge tethered barrage balloon, which I thought was a whale. Being aged 10 and rather gormless, I asked the crew what the film was about. Sex, came the reply. My mum laughed when I told her, but I still didn't get the joke.
Wow.
Nice. Thanks for sending that along, Simon. That was fascinating.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. That's a great article as well. Thank you so much. And former participants of the Battle of Britain served as technical advisors, including Douglas Bader, James Lacey, Robert Stanford Tuck, Adolf Garland, and Dowding himself. It was filmed for $14 million and it only made $13 million back. So at the time, it was considered a bit of a flop, but it made its money back through rentals, and it's probably made it back through streaming now, I'd assume, as well.
Yeah. Basically becoming a cultural icon.
Yeah, it really has.
It's made the film's money back.
Without a doubt. Whoever's got the rights probably isn't suffering the cost of living crisis. Anyway, released in the 15th of September 1969 in the UK and re-released in June 1970, and in the States it came out in November 1969. And the film's also edited into lots of other famous war movies at the time.
Oh, yeah.
Of the day, including the Battle of Midway, Dark Blue World, Das Boot, Hope and Glory, Top Secret, the Val Kilmer comedy has a scene from it in, and the TV series Piece of Cake. I think I've seen those Dorniers more in other films than I have in the Battle of Britain at sometimes. This is that scene of two Dorniers coming in, always in films, I think. And I have a retro review for you this week, and I picked one that was controversial, because we love a bit of controversy on the show. And it's from Roger Ebert from the week of release in America from 1969. And he gave the film 1 star. But I'll read you the first 3 paragraphs. Of all the insults to our intelligence in the Battle of Britain, perhaps the very worst is when Michael Caine's dog looks wistfully into the sky and whines for its master to return. We are asked to applaud heroism because of the discomfort it causes dogs. There was hardly a wet eye in the house. Battle of Britain, in fact, is a throwback to those phony war movies of the 1940s. Remember the obligatory scene of a young pilot lounging around the officers' club? Suddenly an attack alarm sounds, and they all dash out to the right, leaving the fire burning and a few chairs overturned. The faithful old servant moves slowly through the room, dusting chairs, and then the roar of airplanes is heard overhead as our boys fly off to engage the Hun. The servant takes a half-empty pint of beer for the table and lifts to toast the heroes and softly says, "Here's to you, sir." To its credit, the Battle of Britain eliminates this scene, but it catalogues all the others. The pilot staring moodily out the hotel window while his girl looks pensive on the bed, Churchill represented by a cigar, the kid who gets killed in his first mission, the brave little Red Cross nurse, the outcast officer whose early warnings are vindicated, the officious German general, the Nazi pilots drinking champagne, while the harried British gulp tea and make repairs, and intermittable shots of airplanes being shot down.
All right, Roger, don't be stealing it at the trope tally. We've only just started doing it.
He hated it. And I think
really did, didn't he?
American audiences, and I think American critics did really enjoy it, really not enjoy it at the time.
Yeah, there's a documentary with Michael Caine. It's on one of the DVD extras where they interview people outside the American embassy. I don't know if you've seen that. And they're asking what's the Battle of Britain, and most of them don't know. One says, "Oh, is it linked to the War of Independence and such like?"
Oh, wow.
I think, and that was kind of like saying, America doesn't really know about it at the time. It's out of it, the 60s. It's done, and that's kind of in the minds of producers with Britain as well, because you've got the 60s counterculture, you've had the Summer of Love, you've got the CND, you've got anti-Vietnam sentiment, which is spreading over the channel as well. And I think this is kind of like a go at trying to go, well, let's remind people of this. Let's tell this story. Let's put it on to the next generation, yeah.
It does almost feel like the last of a generation of films. And I think Ebert's probably clocked that it has a lot of the feel and tropes. Tropes isn't always a bad word. Those classic 40s, 50s RAF war movies. It just feels like it's sort of a bookend to those in a lot of ways. Because you don't, I can't think of any in the 70s that were made.
Not as big as this. The only one that comes, not RAF wise, but the only one that comes close in terms of production and cast is A Bridge Too Far, really.
Yeah.
And even that feels like an end of an era, nearly 10 years later. It's interesting. But we asked for your one-word reviews, as we do every week, and we got another bumper crop, over 130 replies. Thanks, everybody. Really nice to hear your thoughts. I'll just rattle off a few in no particular order. So we had Roel van der Velde said temper. Paul Watts goes with tally ho. B19.
I hope that was hyphenated.
Pilot it was, yeah. Says a classic film. They cannot and don't make war movies like this anymore. Steve BG went with Stokers. Mark C went with Doorbell. Paul Can again went with Stokers. Scott Isles went with Perfect. And then Tony Wilshire will end with Iconic. So the general consensus there was it's beloved, isn't it? I think.
Yeah,
I think that's the word.
And it's so quotable as well. Well, it is for me, a nerd like me. But anyone who appreciates it, there's all these things to be repeated.
Oh, I think that half of the one-word reviews were quotes. It was a lot of repeat, please. Skipper H. Jerry's.
Daka.
Yeah, it was all that. It is one of those movies that's become infinitely quotable. So Matt, do you want to go into cast for us?
Yeah, I'll just rattle us through because it's a huge ensemble cast.
It's a big one.
In the vein of the big budget classic war epics like The Longest Day and, as we mentioned earlier, A Bridge Too Far. So we've got Harry Andrews as Harold Belfer, the Undersecretary of State for Air, Michael Caine as Squadron Leader Canfield, Trevor Howard as Air Vice Marshal Keith Park of Number 11 Group. We have Ian McShane as a sergeant pilot, which is a really nice inclusion, showing that pilots were enlisted and not just officers. And there's a little bit we can talk about later where the film even talks a little bit about that as well. Kenneth Moore as Group Captain Barker. Laurence Olivier as Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding. Christopher Plummer as Squadron Leader Colin Harvey, a Canadian pilot in the RAF. Michael Redgrave as an unintroduced Air Vice Marshal Douglas Evil, who is the senior staff officer with the fighter command at the time. Robert Shaw is the unnamed squadron leader, just known as Skipper, basically. Patrick Wymark plays Trafford Lee Mallory. Suzanne York plays a RAF officer, Maggie Harvey, who is Christopher Plummer's wife in the film. Barry Foster plays another squadron leader. Edward Fox plays a pilot officer who later becomes a flight leader. And then we have an appearance by Bill Foxley, a veteran of the Royal Air Force who was a burns victim and became very well known for his work advocating for the disabled and those that were burned during their service. And then, interestingly, the film also has a bumper German cast. It's one of those films that takes a departure from overdubbing, and especially for the late 60s, a lot of films were overdubbing or just having the German actors speak English. So we get a German cast speaking German with subtitles, which isn't unusual, but for a film that has a lot of screen time with the German point of view, it's quite interesting. So you've got Kurt Jürgens as Maximilian Baron von Richter, who's the German ambassador to Great Britain, who has a small interaction with Ralph Richardson, who plays the British ambassador in Switzerland. Neither of them are really introduced. It's just, it's two ambassadors in a room chatting about it, and then there's a little altercation, and Ralph Richardson basically tells Kurt to do one.
I lost my temper.
I must say it was unforgivable.
Hein Ries
plays
while he's stirring tea as well. I love that.
While he's stirring tea, palpably British.
Yeah.
Hein Ries plays Hermann Goering. Dietrich Frobos plays Erhard Milch. Peter Hager plays Albert Kesselring. Wilfried von Acker plays Theo Osterkamp. The great Karl Otto von Alberti, which you'll know from a number of episodes we've covered where he's appeared, plays Hans. Yes. There's always one. Hans. Yes. Chonek. How'd you pronounce that, James? Do you know that? Do you know that name?
No.
No. Okay. Because he's chief of staff of the Luftwaffe, so I thought you might know. And then there's a character that is based on Adolf Garland, who Robert's already mentioned was the chief advisor for the Luftwaffe's point of view on the film. Manfred Rederman played Major Falk, is basically what he's titled as, and he's largely based on Garland. So that's interesting that they're basing a character and not including him. Perhaps that was a little bit too uncomfortable for Garland, or maybe they made the production made a choice. Because I believe there was some friction with Garland and some elements of the way that the film was written and depicting. Although he was on board all the way through, but there was a little blip during filming, I believe.
Yeah, well, he walked out a couple of times. But the character is definitely Garland with the cigar and the jacket, and he even has the "Give me a squadron of Spitfire" line that Garland is supposed to have said. So yeah, it's definitely a firm nod to Garland. But yeah, no, he walked out a couple of times. There was a bit of a argument over the fact that the Luftwaffe, didn't give Nazi salutes, which is nonsense. Garland was insistent that they didn't. We weren't Nazis, And there was also a scene that was going to show a German
Garland covering his tracks. Oh,
I know, shock horror. There was also a scene that was going to show a Messerschmitt shooting at a parachuting RAF pilot, and he was like, "Nope, that never happened." So yeah.
We had to wait another 40 years for that to see that in Flyboys 2006.
Clean Garland over here.
Damn, yeah. Basically, I didn't want to go into too much detail on former films that the actors have been in. I just wanted to give us a firm
we're there forever.
run through of, I've missed a few out. It is an ensemble piece.
It really is.
Yeah.
One thing I do want to talk about is, what do you think, James, of the depictions of real characters? People like Keith Park, Lee Mallory, and Dowding. What do you think about those depictions and the way that they've inserted those characters into the film? Because apparently the big conversation about big wings and the disagreement between the two group commanders wasn't, according to I think it was Park, said that it wasn't quite as antagonistic in real life.
Yeah, absolutely. You're reading my mind, actually, because that's what I was going to jump to. Was you've got the scene with the three of them discussing the big wing theory and everything, and Park's going, you can't do this. It takes too long to assemble these aircraft. By the time they're ready for them on the way home, and Mallory's going, well, I get to destroy more that way. And Park retorts, well, they're my airfields that are being destroyed. Know? And Dowdy interjects and says about the fact that we need pilots and we need a miracle and all this sort of stuff. And that scene never happened. That never happened in real life. They didn't meet in that office. They didn't have that conversation. But I defend it, because how else are you going to really bring forward those discussions that were happening behind the scenes? It's a brilliantly done film with that emotive ending by Dowding as well. And it's me defending what a film can do, explaining history in just like a couple of minutes and explaining that event, but yeah, I think one of the phrases I'll have for the film is it does put Dowding in a good light and Park in a good light. especially considering what happened with them later on in the, you know, after the battle and such like. Yeah, I'm all for it. And as I say, that film's one of my favorites. It's not my absolute favorite, but there's a nod to, really appreciate it being made.
Yeah, there's a hell of a lot of exposition, but it's needed because there's a hell of a lot going on.
Yeah,
Like I think we can give it. I was in a big rut with this movie for a while where I was like, it's too long, there's too much exposition, people are talking for my benefit, and then I'm thinking, well, hang on, if you don't, and I always have to remember this, you know, and you have to leave your brain at the door when you start a movie to review it. You have to act like you've never seen it before. You know nothing about the event, and to be fair, you know, if you were a complete novice of history, knew nothing about the Britain, you'd come away with quite a decent, you know, rounded view of it. I mean, there's some bits I think that are a bit hokey. I don't think that the Wehrmacht was ever like really poised at docks waiting to get in on the last Spitfire that had been blown up. Right, lads, in the barges, let's go. I don't think they were.
You mean they weren't
that.
trying on their life jackets?
I don't think they were, no.
Okay.
No. If they were training, if they were training, they really were training for Barbarossa, because there's lads that said, well, they were told us that we were training for the invasion of Sea Lion in, you know, post Battle of Britain, but we were actually next month we went to Russia, so they were really just training for Barbarossa. Like that's something I've heard. I mean, there's a few bits in it that don't ring true, but by and large, as James has said, it's a classic, isn't it? Anyway, so I mean, really, probably should get into alley tallies. It's probably going to be quite a long one.
It's time for Alley Tally on Fighting on Film.
So, James, you're our guest, and in the Alley Tally, we talk about all the cool kit, equipment, things that took our fancy in the movie. Kick us off, please, because we always kick off with the guest.
Those who know me will not be surprised that I'm going to pick the Hawker Hurricane, because, I mean, the Spitfire, it's beautiful. I mean, I was Spitfire mad growing up. I was known as Spitfire Jeffries by some people at school, and I was drawing them and going to museums and absolutely Spitfire mad. The Hurricane is just the workforce, and it is a beautiful, incredible fighter, and is so important. I mean, I roughly about 2/3 of, you know, out of Spitfires and Hurricanes were made up of Hurricanes. Interestingly enough, for the film, in airworthy terms, it's reversed. So you have it's 2/3 Spitfires to that perspective. But yeah, the Hurricane, stable gun platform. It's fast. It's more than a match. It can outturn a 109 in great hands. It's a great aircraft. And it can take a hell of a lot of damage as well. The cannon shells can shoot straight through it, and it can carry on flying. Whereas a Spitfire, you know, and the Spitfire was a nightmare in production to begin with. There's massive delays. Okay, there's minor delays on the Hurricane, but there's more on the Spitfire. Hurricane's easier to prepare, etc., etc. And I mean, there's that argument of, well, if you didn't have the Hurricane, you know, the Spitfire would have been fine. No, it wouldn't have been, because that gap with the Hurricanes would have been filled by Bolt and Paul Defiance and Gloucester Gladiators, and you know, that would be a very different battle at Britain. So I just have to give a nod to the Hurricane. I think it's an incredible aircraft. I think that the film does probably play into the Spitfire myth, maybe not intentionally, maybe just
I was going to ask about that. Are there too many Spits in this film?
For me, yeah. I'm probably going to get a whole tirade of people, but hear me out. It's obviously because of the restrictions of what's airworthy and what's able to be, and that's the fact that the Spitfire was longer in service. There is this want to preserve them. You know, the Hurricane's out of service, etc. There's not as many built, and that massively plays into it. I like the fact that they have got Hurricanes in it. You know, it's not a piece of cake job. Granted, they were even more restricted. I think there are only 3 airworthy.
Well, at least Trevor Howard doesn't hop out of like a Mark 7 Spitfire every time we see him.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's the other thing I really like about, you know, is that they put the right paint schemes on the aircraft. They make an attempt to put 3-bladed props on the aircraft, for example. They do all these things.
Yeah.
They give squadron codes that aren't squadron codes for fighter squadrons at the time, to add to that ambivalence of, okay, it's based on stuff, but it's not actually copying stuff.
Yeah.
Which I really like as well. That gives it
sorry, and it's probably like a conscious choice not to include, because at the audience at the time, it's their kids maybe are going to go and see this film, and you don't want to see a film where potentially you've lost a brother, you know, an uncle, a father, in a squadron that's mentioned by name, and you show them doing something completely different. So that could be a conscious choice by the filmmakers. But mention Hurricanes there, like being the workhorse. Like for me as well, like I love Hurricanes over Spits just because they are the workhorse. There's a great story.
Underdog.
They are the underdog, exactly.
Absolutely.
And I grew up under the flight path of Biggin Hill Airport, famous fighter base mentioned in the film. And there's this famous story of I forget when in the war, but it was definitely early on. It wasn't late war. There was a German pilot shot down, and he was taken to the holding area. I think they kept him in the officer's mess. I can't remember exactly off the top of my head, years ago now. But he was they were sending a report back to say that he was shot down, and he says, "I was shot down by a Spitfire." And the guy writing the thing goes, "No, it was a Hurricane. You definitely shot down by a Hurricane because we've got visual on you being blown up by a Hurricane." He goes, "No, it was a Spitfire. Definitely a Spitfire." He goes, "No, it was a Hurricane." He says, "No, you have to report back that I was shot down by a Spitfire, because if it was found out I was shot down by a Hurricane, I'll never live it down. They'll never let me fly again." That's a great little. that's it in a nutshell, isn't it? Really.
Yeah. And that's so common as well. You don't want to be shot down by a hurricane, even though the chances are you probably were.
Yeah, it's like being shot down by a flying fridge. You don't want to be. You don't want to be reporting on that.
The Spitfire has a sense of an aura around it. I can't think of the right word, but it's linked to the Schneider trophies, the exciting events of the aircraft absolutely breaking speeding records and all the rest of it. But then it is just a symbol of modernity, the all-metal design, the story behind it. And then it has this film, First the Few, middle of the war, 42, that lionizes Mitchell. And from there, you have Spitfire fighter funds. You don't have a Hurricane fund. There's a reason for that. The Spitfire's, for want of a word, sexier than the Hurricane. That's why you've got these things. And it continues on after the war. Spitfire is in service longer. And it's just one of those things. It's just... And I think the film unintentionally carries this myth on. You even toys, there's a dinky Spitfire. There's not, that's the must-have sort of item, and in the posters and such like, it's mainly Spitfires. There is still this thing going on. And the interesting thing was the narrow margin that the film is loosely based on the book actually criticizes the myth of the Spitfire within it. So I thought that was quite an interesting thing, the
irony of that.
It's a pop culture icon, isn't it? Really.
Oh yeah,
it can't be helped.
I really like the inclusion of showing radar and the radar screens. I like that that sequence. That's really good. I think the whole backstory of gathering the aircraft from the Spanish Air Force and having the is it Confederate?
Yeah.
Is it Squadron?
Confederate Air Force, the
Air Force. That's it. Yeah, those guys flying some of the aircraft, and it's also interesting. There's some great behind the scenes photographs of where they've sort of built up the back of a late model Spitfire to look like a Mark I. And all sorts. So there was a real attention to detail where they could do it. You've got to salute the film for that, because where else are you going to see a handful of classic British aircraft take on a hell of a lot of Spanish aircraft that look very much like the German aircraft they were copied from? So it's a fascinating piece of cinema in that all of that air-to-air stuff is beautifully shot.
It's great.
Really, really amazingly shot.
I mean, last week we did Flyboys, and that's all CGI. And it just doesn't have the same feel as this. I know there's shots reused. There's definite reverse shots. There's definitely sped up footage, things like that. But it's done with such a care and attention to making it look correct, and every single explosion or the way the aircraft explode is different. A wing might fly off this way, a fuselage might break off and fly off into the distance. It's so much variation that you can't replicate with CGI, and I think this is possibly why one of the reasons the film endures is because it is all 90% practical effects. Unless you have had you have like a smash cut when something explodes and it's the same, that weird sort of flickery explosion that you see a few times, which always weirds me out because it's not aged very well with modern restorations of the print. But it's great, and I think I'm not an aviation guy really. I'm a boots on the ground type fella, but I like this film because of that. You know, we've come along at this point in 1969. We've come a long way from the fat model Hurricanes that you have in Angels 1.5.
Oh,
it looks a lot better.
Yeah. That, as I say, that's the thing I really like. I mean, there are, you know, the model Stukas that fly, and obviously the Hurricanes and Spitfires that are, and Heinkels that are
anything
crashing.
That hits the ground was a model.
Basically. Yeah, I was just going to put a disclaimer if you hadn't worked that already out. You know, they didn't. Although they do blow up hangars.
Yes, we'll talk about that. I'm sure, definitely.
We will talk about that. But yeah, that's that. You know, as you say, the thing that's really appealing is that you have, and you mentioned Angels 1.5. You have the really quite dodgy models of the Messerschmitts and the kind of Dornier,
the weird bombs, that come down.
And then after that, it's really, I mean, piece of cake. Yeah, they use a lot of footage from the Battle of Britain film.
Exactly.
There's some beautifully shot stuff, actually, you know, by the production crew and such like. But yeah, it's on this scale of real, you know, aerial footage. It's on its own, really, for the Battle of Britain, at least.
Yeah, it is. It really is, and it's another thing where it would be done now. We wouldn't get the same level of attention to detail on the budget as well. Like, you know, nowadays 13 million is nothing, but like back in then, the budget shows for the late 60s.
We got a little bit of it in miniature with Dunkirk, I suppose.
Yeah, we did a little bit. Yeah. Another thing,
I know.
To jump off talking about the aerial sequences there, one thing I like that the movie does, and guess it's Ali Tally, where you actually see the Dornier and the Heinkel crews returning fire with their
about to mention that.
Spandaus, but
the MG-15s.
MG-15s, sorry, and they're not taken for granted. They're not like flag waving crazy Nazi airmen being like, you know, Achtung Schweinhund. They're not like commando book characters. They actually have a little bit of nuance. You feel like, you know, they're not like, they don't encapsulate themselves in the planes and try and smash into Spitfires to get one more for the fatherland. They feel like real people. You know, they look panicked. They look scared. There's a lot of apprehension. There's tension in those bombers. And I like the fact the movie does that.
Yeah, and you do have that balance of the Luftwaffe. You see them on the bases. You know, you see, I mean, reminiscent of the Dam Busters film, the empty chairs at dinner. You know, and that's a completely, you don't see that. They're not Nazi caricatures, are they?
No,
at all. There's no cliches about them. And I mean, the really striking thing, this is something I think Alan Allport pointed out was, and I always think it as well. You see the Heinkels being shot down in the raid from Norway, you know, the north of England, and you're watching the crew struggle to bail out, and some of them, you know, only half out the escape hatches as you see the Heinkel hit the sea. And I mean, that's incredible. And you're thinking, actually, like a few days before, that was happening to Blenheim crews attacking Denmark. That was happening to Wellington crews in September, December, and that's an immediate. Sorry, I just shoehorned Bomber Command in here, which is going to be my thing.
Right. No, it's fine. It's fine. Well, the Bomber Command get mentioned. They get sort of half mentioned, don't they? You don't see them bombing Berlin, but you hear it. That's a nice inclusion. But I'm going to go off on a wild tangent now and talk about the LDV representation, the local defence volunteers.
Of course,
because it's one of my things. If you don't know it, listen to Homefront History, my other podcast.
Never heard of
it. So actually, I think it might be one of the only depictions of the early LDV on the screen.
Badged up,
Badged up as LDV.
The other being Dad's Army just before they transitioned. Yeah, that's that montage where they march in their long johns for a minute.
Yeah, so they come in, they march into the pub, and they're obviously, you know, ending a patrol. And it's a good array of LDV weaponry at the time. They've got some pitchforks, they've got some shovels, they've got a few shotguns that they've purloined from somewhere, and a few of them have SMLEs, which is, you know, quite bang on the money, really. It's not shocking. Depends where they are. They might have had rifles rushed to them. They might have had some rifles even from the American Committee for the Defence of British Homes, but that's going into another complete tangent. And in true sort of representation of LDV fashion, you can't have them being professional for too long. But the minute they're off of their patrol, they go and have a pint, and they have a great little bit of dialogue where Sarge can buy his own. You know, I love it. It's great, but it's nice. It's showing the home defence very briefly without making you, without really forcing it down your neck. And then I like the tiny little bit of Observer Corps that you get representation. I think it's based off that famous photo of the chap looking up to the sky in front of Buckingham Palace, not Buckingham Palace, St Paul's Cathedral, and that's nice. You know, he brings them a cup of tea, and I think one of them might be reading Neville Sneath's aircraft recognition book or a version of it. It's just really nice. There's these tiny little vignettes that show the wider makeup of air defense at the time, rather than just being like, right, it's airplanes and it's girls pushing bits of wood across a table. Yeah. You know, it's more than that.
Yeah, I mentioned that, you know, radar, you've got the downing system kind of explained with the observer corps and such, like you've got these individuals being shown, and you mentioned the WAF there. It's really good that you've got the main character, Maggie Harvey, Section Officer Harvey. And then there is that scene where there are the dead WAFs, and there is you know, one of them's crying and all this, and you just go, they're on the front line, you know, and I think that's a great nod, you know, really for the Auxiliary Air Force, definitely.
Especially in a time where female characters don't sometimes get a fair crack of the whip in war films.
Oh yeah,
we're coming out of that definitely in this, well, as much as you can in 1969. Yeah.
Well, I was watching Dam Busters, and the women in that, the WAFs are serving tea or breakfast, or their Barnes Wallace's wife is the other sort of probably the main female. Otherwise, it's nothing. You know, this is a world away.
Exactly. I mean, less said about her haircut, the better. It's so distracting.
Just don't.
Oh my God. Yeah, it's so annoying. It's so annoying. I'm just like, did she have it in our contract or something that she couldn't have her haircut? It's
really? But she could have pinned it back.
I said, did she?
Oh, no.
It wouldn't surprise me. Pin it back, yeah, exactly.
Maybe they ran out of budget just before they were going to get a barber and hairdresser. Yeah. And they were just
maybe Adolf Garland was like, no, we didn't cut our hair in the Luftwaffe. Anyway, so just my last little alley tally thing, and I have to mention it, is the amount of RAF Bedfords on display. It's almost Bedford Central. I loved it. You got MWs, QLs, O-types, fire engines, fire berths which carry the water, ACD and AEC Matador you see near the pub. That's really nice. Austin K2s. There's a Humber armored car. I think's wrong for the Dunkirk section.
Is it Daimler?
It's a Daimler. I think it might be a Daimler armored car.
Yeah, it's a Daimler or Humber.
I think it's just a few. It might be a year or two out. But it's in there. Germans have a Sexton self-propelled gun, which is a lovely trope of the Germans having completely the wrong.
They have like an M3 half track as well, don't they?
Yes,
rolling into Dunkirk.
It's great. And even things that you don't really see ever, like the barges, representation of that. You know, all the way it sort of shows the, as I said, the wider war. But I had to get the Beddy thing in there, and you can't have a Bedford on screen in a war film without blowing it up, and they do. No. Great. Absolutely love it.
I wonder what the kill count is on Beddies for this film, because it must be fairly high.
Oh, wow.
At least 6 or 7.
Yeah.
I winced every time. I thought, no, not the best.
Not another one.
Not another one. They're just doing their job.
Cut to a Bedford with a tear rolling down its headlight.
That's great.
One thing that stood out to me is one of my favorite parts of the film is those depictions of the RAF squadrons in France at the very beginning of the film. Yeah. And there's some French infantry roaming around, and they've got MAS 36 rifles, which is a very small detail that they've decided to get right. And you got to hand it to them for that.
In your capacity, James, were there French chaps serving on RAF airfields?
Oh yeah, you would have had liaison officers and such.
Right, okay.
And there might have been troops, you know, there on guard and such. I mean, there were French bases, so there was going to be a crossover and people wagging around still, and needed to be there for various reasons. Yeah, absolutely.
Just always wondered. I mean, it makes, obviously when you explain it, it makes complete sense. They're in France, you know.
Were the French in France? Good Lord,
the French in to quote.
The more important question is, can you actually fit 2 people in the back of a Hurricane?
Oh
no, that looks very tight. When the French liaison officer hops in with one of the flying officers, and it looks. That's tricky. Let's hope the next airfield isn't too far away that they're heading to.
Oh, flying, that would be a nightmare.
Yeah.
Can you imagine? Yeah.
Get your damn leg out of the way. What are you doing?
Yeah. I mean, it's a slightly comical scene amongst all the chaos of them evacuating, isn't it? That you see him jump on, and it also says, yeah, they want to continue the fight. There is this sort of, yeah.
I also think it's quite fair to the ground crews as well. You do see quite a lot of them doing stuff, and they're not treated like they are in Piece of Cake, where they're like hated in a weird way.
The class thing comes in as well.
Yeah.
I mean, I watched the film this afternoon, and one scene I really liked was when Skipper's talking to one of the engineers, a flight sergeant. You know, and he says, "You've only got 8," and it's like, well, you know, 5 are write-offs and 2 are missing, and you know, 1 needs this
2 on the 100-hour check.
And Skipper goes, you know, and they've been working 48 hours solid. He says to Skipper, and he just goes, "I know." It's like just do the best you can, you know. And I just love that nod. It's like, yeah, these guys were going without sleep days on end.
Yeah. And they feel like they appreciate each other as well.
Absolutely,
and I think I mean, I'm not going on about Piece of Cake, but that's where Piece of Cake felt false.
Yes.
Where I was like, you're not going to hate the people who are arming your aircraft, repairing them for you, making sure you can go out again and as safe as you can be. Like, you're not going to hate them anyway.
Yeah.
But no, it is nice they get in there. Again, it's the WAF get mentioned. You've got the officers as well. Ian McShane is the sergeant flyer. It's really great.
Yeah.
It's actually, I think the more you talk about it, the more you analyze it, it's a lot better movie than I think some critics saw it as. But obviously they're not as well versed in the battle as we are. So it's interesting.
Just quickly mentioning Ian McShane, Andy's character, I love the fact that he's a sergeant from the East End, because you don't have that with Angels 1-5. You know, the NCOs are the Irks. They're the ones at the top of control towers or wherever it is, looking out, counting the bombs on the airfield. You know, that sort of, and it's almost comical. And you do have that in other films as well. I mean, Reach for the Sky. Yeah, I don't think there's hardly any nod, is there? I think there's
no.
I can't really think of anything. So I really like that in here, that you've got that NCO pilot. I mean, about a third or a quarter to a third, depending on the squadron, were NCOs. And during the war, it was even more. Bomber Command, you have loads. You know, you have sergeants flying Lancasters and such like. So I absolutely love that nod. And also the fact that he's from the East End. You then have that story of his family being killed. Spoiler alert. Sorry if someone hasn't watched it.
Yeah.
And that's an incredibly powerful moment. And actually,
it is.
Yeah.
The Blitz scenes are, we'll get into favourite scenes in a minute, but the Blitz scenes are treated with a lot of respect. And there's a lot more hard-hitting sequences in that tiny little bit, that tiny part of the movie, where you have the lads searching for the family. He's like, turn that damn bell off. And then you see the family have been killed. It really hits hard. But another trope I want to quickly mention before we go off Ali Tally is it continues the trope of having every child, it would seem, in London, or working class child, be a tiny little oik, being like, "I on, of course, they don't need us. You ain't an officer, mate." Like, not why does every child have to talk like that in movies? It's like they're from Oliver Twist. It's bizarre to me. I just don't get it.
Although I do like the fact they got that bit where he says, you know, only officers fly Spitfires.
And he undoes his button.
You know, which is a nod itself to go, hey, look, this guy is a sergeant from the East End. He is a Spitfire pilot, you know. So, yeah.
I think arguably Andy's character has the most development, because even when he's introduced as not being an officer, but not being a slouch either, because he understands French. When Fox's character tries to translate for him, he says he's ahead of him. He knows what they've said already. He translates it for him.
For the benefit of the uneducated amongst us.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And Ian McShane's character is definitely not the uneducated. And then, of course, the tragedy with his wife is even more character development.
Yeah.
It is. And they don't overdo that either. He doesn't become like a gibbering wreck, or can't fly afterwards. He just looks very stoic. He's smoking a cigarette.
There's a scene where he gets into the car with Shaw, and he's very silent and middle distancey, isn't he?
They give each other this look, don't they? They just, doesn't have to be said.
That's a very good scene, actually, I thought.
Yeah, but again, that's the class officer NCO breakdown as well. You have earlier where he's cut out the sir. Have you called your wife? Skipper's going, come on, there's a priorities now. You're back, you're safe. You've got to be okay. He's not going to be a functioning fighter pilot if he's not okay, which I just think is a brilliant little moment. And then later on, after he's lost his wife, he's staying with him, and there is just that moment of silence where They don't need to be any words.
Yeah.
You know, it's
And
brilliant.
even when I think when they're waiting, I forget what the huts are called in the little hut thing. What are those huts called? They have a name.
With dispersal hut.
Dispersal hut. There you go. When they're in one of them, he's just at Ian McShane, just having a cigarette, and he looks a bit pensive, but he's not like, oh, my family, which they would do now. It's nice, and then I like the fact they get rung and they all look really like panicked, like they have to go out again, and it's all right. So tease on, love that bit.
Well, I really like the fact, this is a random thing I didn't think I was going to say. One of the pilots is sick out of fear. You know, the phone rings and he runs out. And it's like, okay, we're not afraid, but we're not, you know, we're going to show these pilots were scared. They were human beings.
They're humans.
Got anxieties. And it's like,
system.
It's world away from Kenneth Moore and such like in Reach for the Sky.
Oh, God, yeah.
You know.
Yeah. So with that, I think maybe we're talking about scenes there quite heavily, like we do. We should stray off. We should move on to favourite scenes.
Hello, I'm Al Murray, and you're listening to Fighting on Film, the world's #1 war film podcast.
So James, as with the Alley Tally, you're our guest this week. Yeah, kick us off.
Okay, I'm going to go with one that I just absolutely love. It's so satisfying to watch. It is when the Polish squadron are in the air and they see these German bombers, and the squadron leader, Barry Foster's character, squadron leader Edwards, doesn't see them, and he gets orders to return back to base because they're a training squadron. And he says this, and the Polish pilots go, screw that. They're chatting amongst themselves, going, Nazis over there, look at them, Germans.
Nimshi.
Literally, yeah. And they just disobey or to say, repeat, please. And they just go into battle, please. And there's just this brilliant frustration from Barry Foster, squadron leader Edwards, where he's just like, they're chatting amongst themselves. He goes, for God's truth. And then he sees them going into combat, and he just says silence in Polish as they're chatting to each other. And it's just, my goodness, it's such a good scene. And it's just the whole sort of like, screw orders, we want to shoot down bombers, you know.
Yeah, I love it. That's also my favourite scene as well. Just because it's a nice little bit of humour when you've had some quite hard-hitting elements of the movie. It's after, I think it just comes just after the Blitz scene. Yeah. So it is nice to have that upturning, and like a wry smile as they go off shouting Nimshi and like shooting the Dorniers down. It's great. I love it. And it's a nice way of including them without having to set them up like massively and having to give them all names and cast them all. It's great to just have them in there being the sort of doing their job, doing what they wanted to do, and it shows in its own way. It shows how the Poles wanted to get back at the Germans for doing what they did to Gdansk and and their country. So it's really nice in there, and I just love it. It's just great writing as well with the repeat please.
Yeah.
It's just eternal. It's probably my favourite piece of writing from the film. And even then, when he is telling them like afterwards, look, we must say like this and do that, and they're just looking at each other like, so what? Like, we're going to do what we want. And then to caveat that, I love the bit where the Pole gets shot down and all the farmers think he's German. He's like, I'm Polish.
But what makes it funnier is like later on in the film, he's got the book up for saying 1,000 words in English.
Yeah, that's
not happening again.
It's a great callback. Yeah.
And the other thing about that scene was there was a bit of reluctance about whether to film it as well.
Oh, really?
Because you've had a lot of awkwardness post 45 with the Poles and the USSR and such like, and the victory parade and all the rest of it going on. They're a bit like, well, do we want to put this in? Not our finest
moment, that's for sure.
Oh, absolutely not.
No,
but they're like, do we want this scene? And Ben Fisk is who was a Polish pilot during the war, goes, no, I want that in there. I want a nod to the Poles, and I just think that's brilliant because they do deserve that nod. And I mean, we've had films since and appearances since, but I just absolutely love the fact that it's there, knowing, about that history beforehand as well.
Yeah. That's fantastic. That's my favourite scene as well. So I won't recover it, but yeah, it's fantastic. What about you, Matt?
I've got a couple. I really like that beginning sequence where they're in France. And it's interesting, isn't it? There's a little bit where one of the planes flies over a column of refugees and troops retreating, and it says, who the hell's he trying to kid? And it's that old RAF not protecting the BAF myth kind of being nodded to.
Pre-Dunkirk, Matt, in 2017. What are you saying? You've blown the war genre apart here, Matthew.
But that whole first, well, I mean, it's like 10 minutes before we get to the credits, isn't it?
Mm.
You know, and the big Battle of Britain title comes across the screen.
But I love the way they transition. Sorry, quick. I love the way they transition into that, where they go, the Battle for France is over, i.e. that whole 10-minute sequence. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Title screen. Great writing. Fabulous writing.
Perfect. Yeah, straight into that brilliant score as well. It's just a big epic moment, isn't it? Just this,
And I like the fact that they show the RAF squadrons are having to, you know, retreat, move their airfields back, but at the same time they're showing that it's causing havoc for the ground crews, because everyone forgets A, that the RAF had squadrons based in France, and B, that there was ground crews that had to escape the advancing Germans as well. So the flight sergeant's told to burn all the lame ducks and get as many people out as he can to the nearest airfield where they're all headed to. And I think that's a really nice inclusion, which didn't need to be in the film, really, when you think about it. But it adds so much context, and gives that real impression of they're on the back foot, and they've been on the back foot since before Dunkirk. You know, it's a grave situation. I already mentioned that it introduces Ian McShane's character Andy really nicely as well. My other favorite scene is the Eagle Day raid, the big raid on Duxford, when they start attacking the airfields, and it begins with that nice back and forth between Kenneth Moore's character, squadron leader Barker, and group captain. Apologies. And Suzanne York, who's the RAF, and they're chatting, and he says, you know, I think they're talking about gas mask bags, you know, not being used as handbags and all this sort of thing, and keeping female personnel out of male slit trenches, that sort of stuff. And it's very much the war hasn't reached us yet, and we're still dealing with things that really don't matter in the grand scheme of things. And then in the background, the Heinkels are approaching, and a dozen Bedfords are being destroyed about 400 yards away. And then all of a sudden, all hell breaks loose. And somehow they managed to, God knows how they got this past whoever was, you know, running Duxford at the time, but they managed to destroy that hangar.
Oh, gosh,
From the First World War.
A historically significant hangar gets blown up.
Imagine Harry Saltzman's been like, I want to blow that up. See that big hangar there? Blow it up. Explode it for me. Harry Saltzman.
I watched it with a friend, and they actually went, that's a really impressive model. And I just went, there's something I need to tell you here. And they didn't believe me for a second. They're like, what?
Reminds me of The Simpsons, where Mr. Burns is like, model? Model?
Oh, God.
But it's great though, because because it's not a piece of model work. It looks fantastic.
It does. It's incredible that they, you know, it's not great that they did it, and it's probably not what Duxford intended for them to actually do to the hangar, but it's quite impressive, and they shot it really nicely and got a couple of angles for it, so they knew they were doing it.
Definitely,
and that sequence is just one of my favorites. And then
send the curator off for tea or something.
Sign this form for me, will you? It says something about production anyway. And then we get that real weight of the aftermath, and Suzanne York is there stood having to deal with the fact that a lot of her, not only probably friends, but also her subordinates have been killed, and they're underneath a tarp. And she goes to light up a cigarette, and a warrant officer tells her to not light it because the mains have been blown, which seems a bit stupid because the hangar behind him is on fire. But we'll let that off. It's
you should have gone over and checked the cigarette fire, you know.
She should have.
All right, I won't light a match. I'll just light it via this fire.
I'll go and smoke over there by the hangar that we've accidentally blown up for production. And it's a moment where her character has a little bit of development. She asserts herself to the warrant officer, because obviously he's a man, but he's also her subordinate. So it's a really interesting scene because a lot's going on, and I like the scenes with Kenneth More's character because he's, you know, he's somewhat fatherly in his approach to her, and it's just an interesting dynamic, and it's got that impressiveness and that weight, you know, emotional weight. So it's one of my favorite scenes. And then I know we've already talked about them, but all of those aerial combat scenes are incredible for the day. I mean, and I watched I think it was a behind the scenes thing, and it was talking about how initially the dogfights weren't aggressive enough. So they asked the pilots to be a bit more aggressive, and that led to like aircraft getting to within like 15, 20 meters of the B-25. They converted to film everything like a camera bus. So the intricacies of choreographing all of that must have been incredible, and the fact that you mentioned earlier, Rob, that all the shots looking up were shot in Spain for that English summer effect, you know,
or
nice
Malta.
clear skies, or Malta, getting all the detail, and then, you know, shooting downwards for in the UK for getting the right colour grass, I'm assuming. So, you know, it's like
Probably
battle of bulge type thing, like
they could have done that, couldn't they?
Get a little bit of snow in there.
Thank God they
rather
didn't.
than Spanish
Although
deserts, you know.
You do get that scene that's the Pas de Calais with this massive hill behind it, because the Pas de Calais is known for its mountainous terrain. When Goering arrives by
and the
train, you know,
lovely
so there are
Spanish
these
port
gaps.
Lovely Spanish port with the two MG-34s defending it. Yeah, love it. Yeah, I like how in that scene where they showed us the barges that have obviously been mothballed, it's almost like you're meant to feel sad for the Germans that they didn't get to invade. I always feel like that bit's like oh, okay,
German soldiers dragging their life preservers behind them as they walk away, sad. Oh, not going to get to invade Britain now.
I
mean, that's
pesky RAF.
That's
there should be a lad at the other end handing them like Parkers for the Russia. Like, don't worry, lads.
Here are maps of Russia. No,
Can you say Barbarossa?
That's one thing I would say that I think would have been a nice nod, is just mentioning the Battle of the Barges and showing maybe some buildings blown up and some sunken barges. But that's me being very picky, because that's my.
No, I agree.
That's the hill that I will die on, is talking about Bomber Command and Coastal Command in the Battle of Britain. It looks like the soldiers just waiting there. You know,
put them in. Yeah, they could have easily put them in. Like they cut some of those egregious scenes with all the Jerrys in, because there are quite a few of there that you don't need.
Yeah.
To me anyway, but that's final thoughts territory in a minute.
Oh, I've got something before we move on. One thing that I did actually want to ask you, James, is that occurred to me while I was watching. There's a great little scene where they are claiming their kills, and I think it's after the Norway raid and they talk about I got one, it had a red band on it, and he gets a third of a kill. What was the actual process for claiming kills? Did someone have to verify that visually, or what was the process behind that? Because I've always wondered that.
Yeah, there had to be verification. There had to be people, you know, other people that have seen it. It's a really, really difficult process. I mean, actually the RAF are probably more scrutinizing than the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe generally took, the person's word, the fighter pilot's word, unless it was absolutely ridiculous. Oh, I shot down 100 Spitfires, you know. And I think they claim thousands have shot down, like, I don't know, 3 or 4 times the actual number of aircraft that are destroyed. I can't remember if that's the exact figure. Whereas the RAF are much more scrutinizing. They take account of the wrecks on the mainland and stuff. I suppose they have that advantage in the Battle of Britain. They can do that. There is an idea. There are people that are critical at the time and say, okay, well, these claims seem very huge. We're looking at figures, you know, via the United States or Sweden or whatever. Well, and Dowding, I think it's Dowding, says, well, there's quite a few that will crash in the sea, ones that are shot up that don't quite make it home, which is true as well. But yeah, the whole process, really, I mean, that's the other thing to remember, really, is when it came to kills, it was for the RAF, it was a squadron effort. So it would be 501 Squadron have shot down, X amount and such. Like the Luftwaffe, it was about the individuals. I think you have this with like, a general thing really with like tank aces and such like, with the Allies and the Germans, but yeah, they are scrutinizing. There are questions. There is well, did you see them? Let's identify this. You have gun camera footage eventually coming in. You do have them in the Battle of Britain. That's another factor to try and back up these claims. And actually, that's one scene jumping to piece of cake I really liked, is when Skull, the intelligence officer, plays in this clip and they goes, actually, this 109 was a Spitfire and this other 109 was a Spitfire. Because the chaos of air fighting, it's just this thing flies in front of you, and if you're inexperienced and scared, you fire away, and it could well be there's plenty of occasions of friendly fire and blue on blue, absolutely. But as I said, the main point was the RAF are trying, much more to verify these kills. There are these
I found that whole scene really interesting, and it really made me think, because it never really occurred to me, how do they verify these things?
Yeah.
Speaking of gun cameras, I really like, I forgot to mention it in the alley tally, but I really like the use of reflex sights.
Oh,
that shot that they
nice.
do regularly through the reflex sight of the Spit or the Hurricane. I really like that. Forgot to mention that in the alley tally, so apologies. Just came back to me there.
Didn't they bug as well? They bugged German officers chatting afterwards.
Yeah.
Flight pilots. Yeah.
I mean, this is an old technique actually that goes back, where you'd listen in and such like, is you'd keep someone on their own for a while, ask them generic questions, and you'd get the, I don't know, name, rank, serial number or something particularly not interesting. You'd leave them on their own for a couple of days, then you'd put them with a couple of other crew members and they'd be like, oh, wow, you're safe. Or there might be someone that they might know, or it's just like, oh, it's a friendly face. And then you would bug that. And all of this stuff would come out. You go, oh, they're based at Abbeville. Okay, they must be with this unit, and it all of a sudden you'd be able to pick up this picture. I mean, it's not unique to the RAF in the Second World War. They're doing stuff beforehand, but that definitely they would do that.
Yeah. Well, one thing I have to talk about before we move on to final thoughts is one of my favourite parts. It's Edward, as the day of recording, Thursday the 13th of April, is Edward Fox's 85th birthday. Should have mentioned that in the cast notes.
Should have.
But should have, completely forgot. But I love it when he crashes into that greenhouse and he gets a cigarette.
Oh, yeah.
And he's like, thanks awfully, old chap. Fantastic. Just love it. And then you don't see him again. Great.
No, that's it, isn't it?
Like many characters, they just get whistled out of the film, but no, it's great. And fair play, Edward Fox, 85, still with us. Fantastic.
It's also Arthur Harris's birthday as well. Obviously,
he's
no longer with us, so
what a link!
Because I'll know those sort of things,
Yeah, and James mentioning Bomber Command again.
I am. I've got to.
I think we should probably move into final thoughts. I'm going to ask you again, James. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean,
jump in.
I think it's brilliant. I'm biased. Yeah, it got me into history, and the more that I read about it, I look into the Battle of Britain. I just think it tries so much. It gets a lot of good things in there. Maybe it tries too much. I don't know. Yeah, you could be critical and go the haircuts. You could go the plastic doorbell.
Oh God, I was about to mention the doorbell because no one had mentioned it yet. But I'm glad you got that in there, James.
Oh no, right. Matt was seething there, like, come on!
Someone mentioned the doorbell.
With the
fucking doorbell.
Growing up, I didn't notice it for ages, but then my dad went, "Oh, you've seen the doorbell," and now it just jars in that scene.
It's not as everyone talks about the doorbell, but no one talks about the mid to late '60s bathroom fixtures.
The haircut is more egregious.
No, I'm not worried. I'm not worried about the haircut, Rob. It's the bathroom that she stood in, and you're like, that doesn't look like a very '40s bathroom to me.
Yeah.
Well, there we go. Anyway, do continue. Sorry, James.
Yeah.
But Yeah, you've got. I think the air sequence is a fact that it's real. It's moved away from the models. It's before sort of CGI and such. Like you've got to watch it and admire it. And that effort of getting the aircraft together and the restoration process. Perhaps it even started the whole Warbird thing. Getting these aircraft back flying and thinking, actually, we need to preserve these. We need to keep these aircraft. We need to get more flying. The musical score as well speaks for itself. I think, again, I'm biased. I just think it fits in perfectly. It's emotional at the right moments. It's stirring, and you've got William Walton's one segment, the air battle in the air, which is the 15th of September, where it's just the music over the air battles. I think it's especially powerful.
Very good sequence.
And the main thing I really like is the nod to the international effort. You've got Canadian pilots, you've got Polish, as we mentioned earlier, and then at the end credits, you've got the full list. You've got, and it mentions obviously Fleet Air Arm, and it mentions, New Zealanders, South Africa, etc. There are mistakes, checks, absolutely. There are a couple of mistakes. So on some of the cuts, it says there's an Israeli pilot, even though Israel didn't exist. There's the mistake there, but I like the fact that it's got this nod. I mean, I'm going to bang that drum again. I would include Bomber and Coastal Command in there, but that's my
Bomber Command gets the tiniest
of
mentions when they're talking about pulling pilots from other places, don't they? They talk about the Fleet Air Arm and the light bombers as possible places to pull pilots from.
Well, they mentioned Coast. They never mentioned Bomber Command by name. They mentioned Coastal Command, saying there's pilots going. They say we could take air crews from the light bombers, but we're scared about doing that because of invasion. No mention that the light bombers are bombing Luftwaffe airfields, barges, and doing loads of other stuff. But okay,
they're busy,
and
they're doing their bit,
Yeah, and the air raid on Berlin, it's the RAF bombing Berlin. It's not Bomber Command. It's almost like there's still this taboo. Do we? Which surprises me because Hamish Mahadi was in Bomber Command, who made a major part in getting a lot of the aircraft together. And he's on the World at War documentary. He's interviewed speaking about his time in Bomber Command, and Foxley as well is Bomber Command. So there are these nods, there are these people involved, but there is this reluctance, and that does grate me a little bit, if you haven't guessed. But yeah, and I think it maybe comes at the wrong time. There is, as we said earlier, there is this change in tone and approach to war film that it sits awkwardly in. And you think about what's happening in the late 1960s going into the 70s and such like. I think that's a factor. But I like the fact that there is this balance. Okay, it's not, you've got the Luftwaffe perspective. You've got these scenes showing the Luftwaffe as pilots and such like. Yeah, it may be emitted far too much. Like we say with Garland going no Nazi salutes, that's taking it too far. But the fact is, it's there. It attempts that. You don't have that in Angels 1-5. You don't have it since. You don't have it in Piece of Cake, First Light, 303 Squadron, etc. You don't have that. So on that basis, hats off to this film doing that. And it is this overall narrative which is impressive. It talks about Dowding, it talks about the systems, but it's also got the pilots. And as you said earlier, it mentions the LDV. It talks about the Downing system. It shows the people on the ground, which I don't think anything else tries to do. Granted, maybe it tries to put too much in that it gets lost. And I can't remember if I said one of the criticisms at the time is there's too many characters. There's no one really to latch on to. So but I think that I think it's brilliant. I think it's a fantastic film. So that's my summary.
I would
sorry, go on, Matt, and I'll jump in.
I would agree. I mean, for me, I think it's a culturally significant film for for Britain and British audiences for sure, and it has that instant reaction whenever it's mentioned of a mix of nostalgia and pride, that kind of thing goes on with it, and I think it does suffer from, in a filmmaking perspective, it does suffer from not developing its characters in a way. Some of them, it makes complete sense. They are people who are killed in action and then not mentioned again. We talked a little bit about that before we started recording, that it's, that is how it was often dealt with. But there's other characters that could have easily been developed, and some of it is just a little bit underdone. Others better, like Ian McShane's character. But in terms of a film, I think in terms of exposition, it's more than forgivable because it's covering such a broad, huge battle. and campaign, really, because there's so much that the filmmakers want to include, not only, you know, giving people those nods like the polls, but also wanting to get across the entirety of the story. Of course, they miss things like Coastal Command, Bomber Command that they could have included. But at the same time, you probably, if you'd done that, you would have had more detriment to character development and the way that the film as a narrative progresses. But in terms of aviation filming, incredible. Score, amazing. The ensemble cast does a great job with the small bits of character development they do have. And also, not all the characters need development. I think it's really interesting the way that Laurence Olivier portrays Dowding, and that almost pessimistic stoicism. And the end of the film is really quite powerful from that performance, I thought.
That's actually something that I read was Dowding originally in mind it was going to be Alec Guinness, and Rex Harrison for Park as well.
Okay,
were the original, who they approached.
Not sure I see that myself.
Oh no, I don't.
No, I mean for me, like that's my hang up. Really, is the ensemble. I think is too big for its own good. And I think it's a shame that Kane is really underused. Yes. I would rather have had more of him.
It doesn't use the ensemble cast as well as The Longest Day or A Bridge Too Far, for instance, or even Midway or something like that. It doesn't make the most of them in the same way.
There's no one to, I think there's no one to pin your hat properly on. They try and do it with Plummer, but his arc isn't interesting enough. Will his wife get it out of London or not? Like, or get out of the way of the bombers or not? That's not interesting enough to me because her character, unfortunately, for me personally, isn't interesting enough to be whisked away and be.
I think it's interesting that she's reluctant to move away from her post. I think that's a significant element in her character.
That's
but
good,
beyond that, there isn't a great deal there other than that great scene where she's reacting to the death of, the WAFs.
Something else I just thought of linked with The Longest Day is you actually have the name of the person appear as well. So it will say Major Howard or whatever. You don't get that with this. It's what's the person's name. So if you watch, I mean, I've watched it a billion times.
Yeah,
so
Harry Andrews appears and you're like, who's this? And it's only if you look at the if you look at the credits, it's it's Harold Balfour, and you're like, oh, okay.
Yeah. It does. That's my issue with it, really. Because there's a lot of people in it. Like Kenneth Moore has maybe 6-7 lines. So does Kane. Like, it's my thing of this is probably the easiest money they ever made, like at the time, because they're just barely in it, and it's a shame because looking back now, I'm like, I wish I would have seen more Kane. I wish I'd have seen more Kenneth Moore, but just because I like those actors. But I think that there was where it maybe could have had some refinement with using its characters a little bit more, maybe telling you who they were, developing them a little bit, and then comes to another gripe that I have. I still, don't get me wrong, I love it. I think some of the movies, what's the word? It is rose tinted. I think a lot of it's held in nostalgia. That's perfectly fine. I think a lot of the audience that saw this when it came out in the cinema, it's a special film for them. Totally get it. It's like our generation, we're under 40. It's probably Saving Private Ryan is the film that kicked off the history within us, definitely for me at least.
Again, not a perfect film either. So
not a perfect film. No film's perfect, really. But it's the scenes where it sort of deviates just a little bit from its main plot, where you've got that scene where Hitler's given a speech, and I'm like, we don't need this. We know Hitler was loved and overdone by the regime and its followers. Like, we know this. I don't need to see it. It deviates a little bit there for me. And some of the scenes where it's developing the German characters, I'm like, great, we're going to get a scene where the guy that's based on Garland has like a duel with McShane or something in the air. We don't get that. Like, they build them up to then do nothing with them. And that's my issue with it. And that's where the ensemble thing comes in again. I've gone in a circle. You establish these people, then you don't do anything with them. And that's why I think Matt said it earlier, where McShane is the most rounded character. And you feel for him over most of them because he gets something to do. He's got some skin in the game, as I say, a lot of weeks, this character has something for you to care about. But that's really my main gripe. It's a classic. The aerial scenes are great. It's maybe a bit too long for some people. It didn't drag on my watch.
No, I think it's paced quite well considering.
Because
yeah,
it is paced well. Yeah, and the soundtrack's great. It it is what it is, isn't it?
I'm there wanting it to be 6 hours long, but that's me.
Where's the hour about Bomber Command? Damn it!
Exactly. But I appreciate, no one's going to sit through that apart from me in an empty cinema. Just a 6 hour.
The Jeffries edit is just edit every other classic war film, every British aerial war film in to make this great grand overview. It is a film that's endured, and we've had numerous people contact us going, when are you going to do this film? When are you going to do about the Brit? It's so important, as with Where Eagles Dare. And it's nice to sometimes do these big hitters, because I say not every week. I say a lot on the show, if you're a listener or if you're a brand new listener, I say not every week can you watch a AAA great budgeted war film with a great cast, everything going for it. You have to watch the minor leaguers. But when you do watch a AAA, it's super sweet. And this is one of those movies.
And you got to get the right guest on for it as well.
Exactly. And I think with James, it's been fantastic.
Thank you.
It really has. Thanks for joining us. So that was the Battle of Britain, 1969. We hope we did it justice, and we hope our criticisms were merited. And thanks again to James for joining us. If you don't follow him on Twitter already, please do. His career seems like it's going places, and fantastic time to have you with us again. And do join us next time for another war movie. And we'll catch you next week.
Thanks, James. Thanks everyone for listening.
Bye, everyone.
See ya.
Bye.